Hello, everybody. I wanted to go ahead and give you just a little bit of information about visual aids because, of course, we will be doing the visual aid throwdown soon. Yay! We won't be talking about visual aids necessarily in class before that. So I want to make sure that you have some information. So I'm going to talk a little bit about visual aids real quickly. First of all, the thing about visual aids that you all should be paying very close attention to is that visual aids should do a couple of really core things. And there's really 4 things that are really important. One, the visual aid should be relevant to your topic. Really important. Obviously, we want to choose visuals that are representative of ideas, concepts, and things that we did during our time in our capstone. The second thing is it needs to be useful. And that useful bit is probably the most important piece, right? Because if you're going to add a visual to your synthesis or to your presentation, it should help explain something. You've all heard that expression, a picture's worth 1,000 words. It really is important to have a visual that helps you and is useful to you in explaining some other important concepts from your work. If it doesn't add value, then there's really no reason in it taking up space. For the purposes of your capstone presentation, your symposium presentation, a good visual should eliminate a lot of additional text and explanation that you might otherwise need. Third, it should be visually interesting, right? We don't want boring visuals. We want something that's going to attract an audience member's attention and get them engaged with your work. And last, every single visual aid, no matter what it is, needs some sort of self-explanatory caption. As you probably noticed from your own experience, if the first time you look at a poster or you look at even a magazine article, something like that, chances are your eyes were drawn to the visuals first. Oftentimes, we look at a visual, we check out the caption so we understand the context for the work. Without a good self-explanatory caption, a visual just isn't quite as good as it could be. So even in your synthesis and your symposium presentation, you should have a self-explanatory caption that answers the basic questions, sort of journalistic questions: the who, the when, the what, the where, and the why, and sometimes the how as well. So try to think about those things as you're putting together your caption. Obviously, captions can't have typos. So you want to make sure there's no typos in the caption, no typos in the visual aid, and always be thinking about how you can improve your work, especially as we're doing this in our class. We want to try to improve, right? Especially with the visual aid throwdown, you want to go ahead and think about this as an iterative process. All right, I'm not going to go through all of the various criteria for each type of visual aid, but I will put them up on the screen so that you have them. They are also in the guidelines. I want you to make sure that for all the visual aids that you present at the visual aid throwdown, for your synthesis, for your capstone presentation, during the symposium, that your visual aids meet the guideline criteria. So check out that packet, make sure that you meet the guidelines. These are the guidelines for tables. Tables are, although they are visual aids, they're not the most interesting visual aids, but they can be relatively useful. Now, there are some types of data that tables are not really useful for. Tables are not great for displaying relatively simple information. Here's a very simple table that highlights the percentage of different ball colors produced in each month of the year. That's somewhat interesting, but not super helpful. One, because there's no informative caption, and also because the data is relatively simple and probably could be displayed another way. I will show you another way to display that in a moment. Tables can be more useful, one, if they have an explanatory caption, like this one does, and if they actually describe more complex data. Now, in this case, there are multiple types of data from different sources and with additional footnotes and comments that can be more explanatory to folks. And this is certainly a step up from displaying it as just a text paragraph, a little bit easier than that, but probably a more visually interesting way is to display most types of information. Figures and graphs are extremely important for displaying information for your capstone work. These are the various guidelines to think about, talking about titles, talking about captions, talking about axis labels, tick marks, things like that. Please read through those guidelines. Now, most of you will probably be producing your figures and graphs using Excel. It's a very common program to use. The problem, of course, is that the default settings within Excel are not always very useful and can make for fairly ugly graphics. Here's an example. This is the blue and red ball data. There are a lot of things wrong with this figure. Maybe take a second to think about what are some of those things. Have you taken it all in? Are you making a mental list of things that are wrong with this figure? I'll give you a couple of ideas from my own perspective. Well, first of all, we're talking about blue and red balls. Why is yellow and green the color choice here? The background, the gray background with all of those tick marks and vertical lines, not really necessary or relevant and a little bit distracting. There are numeric headings over each one of the bars. Why is that necessary? We have a vertical axis label. We also have a horizontal axis label. Now, those things could be more descriptive. I don't know what the units are for the vertical axis label, for instance. And there is no caption. These are all things that could be done to improve, these are all things that could be added or changed to improve this figure. Here's the same data displayed in a different way that's a little bit more logical. First of all, we have clear axis labels, we have a caption, the color choices are correct, and a lot of the background material the background has been simplified just to clean up the graphic. It's a relatively easy graphic now to understand and would be a clear thing for your audience members to take in. There are, of course, more complicated types of graphs that can be produced. This is a graph that has multiple axes. So you have a primary axis and a secondary axis. It's combining both a bar chart and a line chart, which is very interesting. And so if you have a more complicated type of data, then a multi-axis chart like this is not a bad approach. Here's an example from a previous capstone student. This is a pie chart. I think we've all seen pie charts in the past. And pie charts, again, are fine for representing fairly simple data. The problem with pie charts is that they tend to be overused. We see them in all sorts of popular media, and it's sort of a default for many of us as we are seeking to create graphics. The real issue comes with distortion when you have many different segments to the pie. This is pretty easy because you've got clearly what looks like 50% of the pie is very important, and then 25 and 25 for somewhat or a little important. Pretty cut and dry. Now, unfortunately, there are lots of different ways to display pie charts that are more that represent more distortion and make it more difficult for people to understand the underlying patterns. So here's an example of a pie chart that could be easily produced in Excel. And obviously, because it's three-dimensional and tilted on its side, it's very, very difficult for us as audience members to differentiate what each pie slice represents. What percentage of the pie are we seeing in each one of those slices? So again, there's no additional information like a caption, so we don't know what these various pie segments represent, but there are likely other better ways, bar charts, for instance, for representing this kind of data more clearly. Another very popular type of visual aid are photos, or what we call plates typically. Here are the various guidelines for photos and plates. One of the things I will point out is that you definitely want to make sure that you have a high resolution image when you're doing something with a photo or plate. But there are lots of other things to consider too, especially if you're taking the image from another source. You want to definitely give credit where credit is due. So take a look at those guidelines. Now, the most important thing, obviously, as I mentioned, You want visuals that are relevant, that are useful, and that are interesting and have explanatory captions. Here's an example of a photo that is none of those things, right? Our caption, not super explanatory, doesn't tell us much of those about the sort of journalistic norms of who or the where or the when or the why. Also, is this image relevant or useful? I don't know. Do we really need an image that tells us what it looks like? Take notes in a meeting? Certainly, it's not extremely interesting. And you might say a couple things about whether or not it's actually even a very good photo. But this is just an example. Here's one that's perhaps more useful, relevant, and interesting because it's describing something that's perhaps a little bit more complex. In the case of this particular research, useful for understanding the methodology that was employed. It's visually interesting, not just because of the subject matter, but also because of the way the photo was taken. The photo demonstrates pretty clearly a couple of key photographic principles. We have a nice diagonal across the image. The image is split up in what we sometimes refer to as the rule of thirds, where you have interesting elements divvied up across different quadrants of the image. And then also it has an important descriptive caption that even provides reference to the copyright holder. So a good image there. Here's one from a previous Capstone student. Again, this particular student was doing work on an arts program in a school, and they were doing tree etchings. This is useful, relevant, it's interesting, and it has a descriptive caption as well. So, and I should point out, there's no copyright here because the author represented this work. So, if you were not the photographer, you would want to go ahead and include a copyright. So think about the types of visuals or photos or plates that you might use. Other types of visuals, there's a lot of other types of visuals out there that you can use for your work. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. Please take a look at the guidelines in the guideline handout. A couple of different examples though. Diagrams, very important for describing processes. In this case, processes of photosynthesis and degradation and nutrient cycling in the ocean. And this was something that was drafted up in another program. You could do things like this though in PowerPoint. One thing it's missing, of course, is a caption. I will point out that diagrams like this are useful in, say, the synthesis. This is a fairly complex diagram. And so if you were to represent this in your poster or your synthesis, I'm sorry, your symposium presentation, you might need to simplify it a bit. Here's another example from a student's work where they were using a diagram to explain their experimental methodology. This is something that could easily be done in PowerPoint. And as you can see, a diagram like this helps to explain something that in words might take multiple paragraphs. So it is useful and relevant in that regard. Could it be more interesting? Perhaps. Now, some of you will be doing work or have done work that maybe does not lend itself well to a lot of other visuals. Policy work and work in business and sustainability don't always have a lot of other good visuals, but you can come up with some really interesting diagrams. I would encourage you to take a look at PowerPoint under their smart art features. They have a lot of different examples of diagrams that can be used. Venn diagrams, process diagrams, flow diagrams are all very useful ways to display information. Here's an example from a previous Capstone student representing key business stakeholders in a colorful way that helps get the point across. I should mention that not only does this have a descriptive caption, but because this material was adapted from another source, this student has included a citation for that, which is helpful for attributing the work to the original authors. Here's more of an artistic rendering that can be used as a visual aid. This is showing the progress of English ivy taking over a forest and choking out native vegetation. This is actually from Green Seattle Partnership. It's been used pretty extensively by previous students. The copyright here is Green Seattle Partnership. You can see that in the lower margin. But again, here's a visual representation that's showing change over time. A creative way, a visually interesting way to display that information. Maps are another way that students may choose to display visual information. There are bad maps and there are good maps though. Be careful with Google Earth. It can do some pretty wild things that are not extremely helpful. With any sort of map, you want to try to make it simple whenever possible, and it should help orient your audience member to where they are on the globe. So there should be more or less a "you are here" kind of approach with some sort of marker on the map to orient your audience member. Maps can do multiple things. In this case, this is a combination of map and a plate. The inset shows us where we are in Nova Scotia. This is the coastline of Nova Scotia, and you see the compass rose and a scale bar, so we understand what sort of area we're looking at. And there are points demarcating sample sites along this coastline. And then these plates that go along with the map display some attributes of the various habitats. And there's, of course, a descriptive caption as well. So you can combine maps along with plates to make for more informative information and to make it more visually interesting as well. Here's a map that a previous Capstone student put together. The student wanted to explore ArcGIS and use the map to map out wolverine activity areas for their project that they did with a conservation organization. The thing that's really important to think about when you're doing maps is how you plan on displaying them. This is visually a very interesting map, but there's a lot of detail and it is fairly complex. And so if you're going to display a map like this on a poster, you want to make sure that it's large enough that we can take in all of those details. Same thing if you're doing it in print for your synthesis. So making an image like this a full page makes a lot of sense. You also want to make sure that your legend detail is a large enough font size that it can be seen from a distance. In this case, the fonts are they're a little bit small. All right, that about does it for the types of visuals that I wanted to show you right now. There are, of course, other types of visuals, and I would encourage you to explore other options. As part of the visual aid throwdown, you'll have a chance to get feedback on your work, share that with others, and enhance and improve your visuals that you will eventually incorporate into your synthesis and your capstone symposium presentation. If you have questions, please reach out to me. I'm always happy to help. Otherwise, have at it, and I look forward to seeing what you produce. Bye-bye now.